After 3 years of small roles on stage and screen, Jimmy got his big break when director Elia Kazan caught Jimmy's performance as an Arabian gigolo in a play called The Immoralist. Kazan had directed Marlon Brando in both A Streetcar Named Desire and the classic On the Waterfront. He was considering Brando and another screen idol, Montgomery Clift, for the lead roles in his screen version of John Steinbeck's East of Eden, a retelling of the biblical tale of Cain and Abel, set in California in the early 20s. Brando and Clift couldn't agree which brother they would play, so Kazan decided to use unknown actors instead. Once he met Dean, Kazan decided Jimmy was ideal for the part.
I called him into the Warner Brother office, and he came there, and he just sat there looking rather surly and unresponsive. Then he finally said to me, "Do you want to ride on my bike?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll take a ride on your bike." So I got in the back of his bike, and he went around the city in the goddamn bike, and I wish I'd never met him. But as I got to talking to him more and more and more, I said, "This guy's it." And I called Steinbeck up. I said, "I'll tell you, I found a guy that may not be a great actor, but he is it." I said, "Is that important?" He says, "If he's it, send him up." So I sent him up to John, and John said, "I don't like the guy, but he's it." He said, "He's the guy."
Kazan also auditioned another young actor, Paul Newman, for the part of Cal's brother Aaron, but instead chose Richard Davalos. For the female lead, Kazan cast Julie Harris.
He just reminded me from the very beginning of Tom Sawyer, a guy who would always get you to paint the fence and get you into the terrible scrapes, but it was all like, well, what's life for? It's not to just go plodding in the same places every day, but it's an adventure. I thought he was absolutely mesmerizing. I thought his performance was so beautiful and had such variety to it.
Leonard Rosenman composed the score for East of Eden and was James Dean's first flatmate in New York.
I think that this kind of runaway, the leather-jacketed man running from society, which was the figure of that time, which was a kind of middle-class version of the Wild Ones, which Brando had done several years back, was the kind of thing that Jimmy was compelled to do in some way, but at the same time, there was a side of him that didn't want to do it, and that's why, of course, he went into analysis toward the end of his life, as he really sought to avoid that.
Jimmy had great curiosity as a young man.
Martin Landau.
That's one of the things that bonded us in a way. And oddly, one would kind of think that Jimmy was a cynic, but he wasn't. I mean, a lot of people in retrospect say Jimmy probably had a death wish. I don't believe that at all. You hear people say, well, it was inevitable and he wanted to die. That is not the case.
Once the cast had been confirmed, they flew to LA to begin filming. Jimmy carried all his belongings in 2 brown paper bags. Kazan encouraged friction between Dean and his co-star Raymond Massey as he sought to bring out the repressed memory of Jimmy's lost mother and distant father to give emotional force to the scenes.
My mother, she's not dead and gone to heaven, is she?
Why do you ask that?
She's not dead at all.
George Perry, author of the new James Dean biography.
She's alive.
There is a scene in East of Eden in which James Dean tries to win his father's love by giving him back the money that he's lost on some speculative venture. And his father rejects it on the grounds that the money, in his view, hasn't been acquired legitimately. And the rejection is so painful that James Dean absolutely breaks down on the set.
What is this?
It's all the money you lost on the lettuce.
You made it?
Yeah.
But how?
Beans.
Beans?
We bought futures at 5 cents, and war came along, and the price went sky high.
Cal, you will have to give it back.
No, I made it for you, Dad.
You'll have to give it back.
Who?
To the people you got it from.
British Purchasing Agency? I can't give it back to them.
Then give it to the farmers you robbed.
We didn't rob anybody, Dad. We paid 2 cents a pound, 2 cents over the market for that stuff.
Cal, I sign my name, and boys go out, and some die. And some live helpless without arms and legs. Not one will come back untorn. Do you think I could take a profit from that?
Raymond Massey, who was playing the father, was absolutely unprepared for this tremendous onslaught, but being a great pro, he stayed in character. And of course, Kazan let the scene roll. And it's one of the most powerful things in movies. And a lot of people who saw that thought, this is such an amazing performance from a young man. He can't be acting, it's got to be real.
Elia Kazan.
But what I photographed was their relationship to each other, the absolute hatred that Ray Massey felt for Jimmy Dean and the hatred Jimmy Dean felt for Ray Massey. That's precious, man. You can't get that. No director can get that. You hopefully arouse it. You're essentially awakening something that's there by some tactic or other, some means or other, by some hint or other, by some stimulus or other.
During the filming of East of Eden, director Elia Kazan arranged for Jimmy's hero, Marlon Brando, to visit the set. Dean idolized Brando and was nervous in his company. They met several times over the years, and Brando apparently enjoyed teasing the younger star. The late Sammy Davis Jr. on a TV special in 1974 recalled an occasion when Jimmy invited himself to a party with Marlon Brando.
I talked Jimmy into coming to a party that Ella Logan was giving for me in the Valley. And she said, gee, I've invited all your friends and all your buddies, and you know what, I've invited Marlon Brando. Do you know him? I said, yes, I know him from New York. So I'm telling Jimmy about this that night, and he says, can I come? And I said, of course you can, man. And he said, all right, I'll be there. And he wore Marlon's complete, you know, the wild one, wore the whole outfit, came in on the motorcycle, walked in with the leather jacket, the boots, everything, and Marlon arrived in a suit and a tie. And Jimmy went, he tricked me, man. He really tricked me. And it was so funny because that night they hung out and talked, and I remember asking about a year later, have you seen Marlon recently? He says, no, man. He's on the lot, but he won't even speak to me.
Martin Landau.
Marlon and Jimmy met a few times, and there was no question that there was a degree of rivalry, but it was natural. But they really couldn't play the same roles. I mean, if you really looked at it, just in terms of age, even though there wasn't that much difference between their ages, but you thought of Marlon as older and Jimmy as younger.
George Perry.
Jimmy had a different approach from Marlon Brando, actually. He does things that Marlon never did. He has a vulnerability that isn't there with Brando. And I think this is one of the reasons why his appeal has gone on lasting. Women always found that they wanted to protect him. You know, there's something so damaged and demanding care and love. And Jimmy sort of could project this in a superb way.
Marlon was the same thing in a man, and Monty Clift was the same thing in a softer man, and Jimmy was the same thing in a boy, and the first one. And every boy in America could identify with it. When it's visceral and when you say, I know that, I feel that, I am that, I mean, wow. And I understood that at the time. I said, wow, I mean, he's going to be a major movie star.
Dennis Hopper.
He admired Brando and Clift very much as actors. And he said, the reason that I'm going to make it is because I've got Marlon Brando in this hand saying, screw you. And I've got Montgomery Clift in this hand saying, help me. And somewhere in between is James Dean.
Once work on East of Eden was finished, Jimmy went back to his family's home in Indiana with his photographer friend Dennis Stock to shoot a series of photographs. One of the most memorable shots is of Jimmy sitting in a coffin, an image that has often been reproduced to support a common perception that Jimmy had a death wish